Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to do a little tag team presentation here to try to just kind of give you two different aspects of the work we're doing at Project Drawdown, which is really focusing on climate solutions. This morning, we heard a lot about the science of climate change and kind of, how bad it could be, especially from David. And, I was thinking as we were hearing all that about jumping into that big kind of crevasse that's open into the street in front of the convention center, the big, I don't know, it felt like a pit of despair. But throughout the day, we actually heard a lot of hope and optimism and solutions. And I'd really like us to kind of end, I hope, today on this note of solutions, that while we are facing some of the greatest challenges humanity's really ever faced when we think about the climate crisis, we also have the greatest opportunities, the greatest kind of knowledge set, and the greatest toolbox ever in human history to address these kinds of challenges. So I think it's important to focus on challenges and solutions, and that's what we're going to wrap up with today a little bit. So at Project Drawdown, we focus on this time in the future when we solve the climate challenge, when we basically get to the moment of drawdown, when climate basically warming gases like CO2 are now increasing in the atmosphere, but someday, soon we hope, they'll stop and begin to decline. And that point we call drawdown is the moment that we are really working toward and hoping to achieve very, very soon. Basically, to get there, there are three ways we have to approach it. One, of course, is to just stop the bloody emissions. It's that simple. You want to stop a problem, stop the problem. This isn't that hard. And I'll just save you a bunch of work. It's actually doable. There's absolutely every reason to show that we can do this. Where do we have to do this? Well, we have to stop the emissions, stop them from going up in the atmosphere, and basically from 5 different sectors. This is a kind of graph for the world as a whole. We could draw it for Pittsburgh and it would look a little different. You can draw it for Pennsylvania or California or wherever, but this is the global average kind of map of where the emissions actually come from. About a quarter of climate change comes from making electricity, burning coal and oil and natural gas, things like that. About a quarter from the world's emissions actually come from the land and land use and agricultural sectors, basically producing food. Interestingly, the 2 biggest contributors to climate change are food and electricity, and together they're about half of climate change emissions. Then we have industry, and then transportation, and then buildings. So those 5 sectors are about 90% of the emissions come from those 5 things. And fortunately, we have solutions that can actually address all of these. That's what we do at Project Drawdown, is we basically review the latest science, the latest economics and technology for different climate solutions, and we've looked at well over 100 of them and kind of map them into these spaces and just kind of figure out how much can we do and where. Well, in electricity, this is probably the easiest sector to solve in some ways because the technologies that do replace fossil fuels exist, they're getting cheaper, and they're getting scaled tremendously. So solar, hydro, wind, energy storage, even nuclear, things like this do exist in this sector, and they're growing very, very well. Solar and wind now are cheaper than burning coal for generating electricity in most of the United States, and market forces are really going to take this one over. Here we just show one example of solar on rooftops, which is a good solution, and we have many, many, many more. We also have to look at solutions in the agricultural space, especially what is releasing greenhouse gases from agriculture, which is primarily deforestation. It's methane from cattle and rice fields, and it's also nitrous oxide from overusing fertilizer. We have dozens of solutions that we look at in this space as well, but one of the most important is right at the source. What we can do at home and what we can do in our businesses and schools is reduce food waste. About a third of all the food in the world is never even eaten, so that means about a third of the greenhouse gases that are emitted to the atmosphere from food aren't necessary at all if we address food waste. And right here in Pittsburgh, you have 412 Food Rescue kind of organization, which is one of the best kind of food waste organizations in the country, and you're really pioneering great work here in Pittsburgh. That's a national model, so you should be really, really happy about that great work you're doing right here. Industrial emissions are obviously a big concern here. We heard a lot about the kind of growth of petrochemical industries that could be happening in this part of the world. And we have to think very, very hard about that. So those are a big issue, whether it's petroleum or plastic or other things. These are huge, huge sources we have to consider. One that doesn't get very much attention, but we looked at it very hard within Drawdown, is refrigeration. Not just the energy used in air conditioning and refrigerators and freezers, but the chemicals used in the coils of those compressors, what are called hydrofluorocarbons. Those are also potent greenhouse gases. So when we kind of dispose of air conditioning equipment, we have to make sure that the chemicals in those coils are recovered or destroyed, not allowed to leak into the atmosphere. So that turns out to be a major issue as well. And then we can keep going, whether it's in transportation, kind of electrifying the transportation sector with electric vehicles, electric trains, and so on. That's going to be hugely important. And of course, buildings. This is just the energy use within the building per se, but energy is always put into buildings, whether it's through electricity or transport to buildings. So that's just the combustion on the building site itself. Buildings turn out to be very, very important because they affect a lot of other issues. This is really kind of where you start those, reduce emissions right at the source. Now it turns out that we can also kind of help out the transition to a climate-safe future by also working with nature. That there are ways that nature can remove greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. First, we've got to prevent putting them in there in the first place, but it turns out nature pulls some of the CO2 we put in the atmosphere out just by naturally doing photosynthesis and chemistry. Right now, land and oceans, primarily forest and oceans, are removing about 40, 45, 50% of the greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere each year. And we can only bet on that happening in the future if we protect our natural ecosystems, especially forest, agricultural lands, and oceans. Land-based kind of sinks of carbon that nature does for free right now are very, very important, and they require that we protect and maintain and enhance our forest and working landscapes. This is going to be very, very important in the future. And also what we do in oceans, whether it's protecting coastal areas, restoring mangroves or oyster beds or seagrasses or whatever, ocean-based removal of carbon will also be very, very important. We heard earlier today, too, the possibility of us adding to what nature does already, not only by planting more trees or restoring more ocean ecosystems, but actually building machines that can capture CO2 out of the atmosphere and maybe store it or convert it to something useful, making a kind of a closed loop of carbon. These are still basically in the pilot scales right now, but they might be a way of augmenting the challenge of addressing climate change in the future, and we should kind of keep our eyes open to this as well. Finally, though, we don't want to just reduce emissions and protect nature. We also have to kind of help ourselves. And it turns out in Project Drawdown, we found that often when we advanced kind of a human agenda, especially around equality, health, and education, sometimes we also had climate benefits to this. One of the best, for example, might be around educating young women and girls, universal access to education, universal access to family planning, or in protecting indigenous communities' land rights. All of these things you might think of as first a human rights kind of solution, and they are. But they also have tremendous climate benefits of slowing population growth, securing more natural stores of biodiversity and carbon with indigenous communities protecting their land, and so on. So even when we think about advancing human rights, often there are human benefits and climate benefits from these kind of advances. So this is kind of how we look at the map of different solutions. We have many of them. First and foremost, stop the emissions. 2, protect nature. 3, advance human quality of life. And when you do these 3 things, we find there's a whole plethora of solutions. None of them are adequate to solve climate change individually. That is, there's no silver bullet here. But there are a whole bunch of pieces of silver buckshot. If you put it all together, this is about 80 solutions here. We have more than enough to address climate change already in existence today. And there are, in fact, solutions that are good for us. They're all good for the economy. Every single one of those returns more money to the economy than it uses to start deploying it in the first place. And of course, they're good for the future in that they avoid the more catastrophic scenarios of climate change we heard about this morning. So this is the good news. This is like an environmental person coming to you saying, hey, we actually have some good news for a change, okay? At least that these solutions exist. The problem is that we haven't deployed them as quickly as we need, although there are some early promising signs, especially in electricity and other sectors where we're making some real progress. What's next for this kind of work? Well, there are a lot of things that we need to be thinking about, and I'll ask my colleague Crystal to tell you more about this in a second. But at Project Drawdown, we want to make sure that the work we do on climate solutions is always grounded in science, Just like understanding the climate problem, that's also how we have to understand climate solutions. There are going to be a lot of people out there trying to sell climate solutions to you and to policymakers and others. We want to make sure that they're right, kind of being like the consumer reports for climate solutions, if you will. But we also have to make sure that they can work at the community scale. A lot of the decisions that affect climate change happen in places like Pittsburgh, not just DC, not just the UN, but they happen in and around our communities. It's the decisions you make about your electrical use, your land use, transportation, the kind of industries that are here, and so on and so on. So much of the power to confront climate change is at the local and state level, and we need to really help communities do this, and Crystal can say more about that in a second. And we also need to help encourage businesses to see that there are leadership opportunities here to advance their business and to advance the agenda of climate solutions. We need to do it all. We can't just say, give up doing business, but we can't do business as usual because it leads to a path of destruction. So with that, I'm going to stop here and then ask my colleague Crystal to come up and tell you a bit more about the next phases of our work.
Thank you, John. So I wanted to talk about what I think are 3 keys to climate action that also relate to the work we do at Project Drawdown. So the first key is collaboration. And collaboration is so important to us at Project Drawdown that this is why this world-renowned climate scientist is sharing the stage with his decidedly not famous colleague. In doing our Project Drawdown's analysis of the most effective existing solutions to global warming, we knew that it was important to demonstrate and be an example of collaboration. So we brought together a team of, to date, 75 researchers from 26 countries on 6 continents. And this is a multinational, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multidisciplinary team. And this is collaboration is so important, and collaboration across sectors is so important to climate action. And we have right now in this room an excellent example of that. I know you all get it. A second key to climate action is systems thinking. And you saw this slide a bit earlier. There are 80 solutions that Project Drawdown analyzed, but they work together as a system. None of them will get us to draw down on their own. A third key to climate action is to be informed. And Project Drawdown's mission is to be a source for information about solutions. I want to tell you some of what's available at our website. There's quite a bit of information about how the solutions work as a system, how they work as an integrated whole. This is a visualization of one of the sectors of solutions that our team has analyzed. You'll find at our website information as well as visualizations of how solutions interact, individual solutions, clusters of solutions, how the various sectors influence each other. You'll also find information and graphics that illustrate the current and future adoption of solutions, compare growth scenarios from plausible to optimum adoption of solutions, because how we reach drawdown and how fast we reach drawdown depends on how quickly and how broadly these solutions are taken up around the world. And you'll also be able to compare the greenhouse gas emission impacts of individual solutions. As John mentioned, there's many communities around the world that have found this work and this global view of solutions to be inspirational and to be a framework where they can work. So at Project Drawdown, we've taken a global view of solutions. We have not yet drilled down into specific geographic locations, but that's the work that's being done on the ground around the world. And communities everywhere from Long Island to Zimbabwe have found their place within this broad spectrum. It's really a way that lets individuals and communities see their place in this broad view of humanity's action on climate. And citizens around the world are using this work to engage their families, their friends, their communities, as well as their local elected officials. And we are in turn learning from the creativity of people who are doing the work of seeing what solutions apply best to their geographic regions and communities, and helping connect these communities and share the learnings. We also have a Drawdown Learn program where we're developing more information resources and communication resources to communicate this science to broader audiences, to support teachers in classrooms, to teach this information to students. We don't want to leave our students hung out there with only a picture of the problem and thinking that there's nothing that can be done. So getting this information about solutions that are already happening around the world, we're not starting from scratch. This is such an important message to get to our students and teachers around, definitely around the US and other parts of the world are teaching this information. Our work is to connect them so that they can learn from each other. John mentioned that we're going to be working with businesses in our newly launched Drawdown Labs initiative to help industry leaders and business leaders who step forward to explore the next level of collaborative business leadership on climate solutions. So I invite you to visit us at drawdown.org. Even if you are well-versed in climate solutions, I promise you there's something to learn there. Thank you.